So I'll take this a little bit at a time. The word black, as reference to us, only appears in this speech once. We appear as though summoned by the mention of justice, because it's always imagined that there's only certain issues that are black issues. So even though we're talking about things like pandemic recovery, all kinds of issues, the environment affects black people, of course, environmental racism particularly impacts Indigenous and black communities, but there's no specific mention. And then the minute you say justice, here come black people. But of course, there's nothing substantial around that. In fact, justice reform gets a whole sentence in the speech, and it just says we will continue to work on justice reform. Of course, it's not clear what has even happened on justice reform. We did get the gesture towards ending mandatory minimums on drug charges, for example, but Crowns and police maintain their prosecution. So we know that, maintain their discretion. So we know that there will be no changes because white people already don't get convicted and charged on drug offenses. They're almost entirely directed towards Black and Indigenous people at this point. And then later on in the speech, we get a surety that we will continue to be tough on guns and be tougher on guns. And of course, we know the discourse around borders, guns, drugs, and gangs. This is extremely racialized discourse. So what we've actually seen on justice reform is they've gestured towards white people essentially and said, don't worry, your child won't go to jail if they're caught with drugs. But then they're like, don't worry though, guns, we're still going to prosecute these black people. And she talks about gun violence in our major cities, except the biggest gun crime in Canada in recent years was in Port of Peak, Nova Scotia, a white man who dressed up as a cop and shot everybody. So that's not in a major city, and it was a white man. So we're not interested in addressing gun violence when it's, a white man driving around dressed as a cop. But what we're saying is, don't worry, these black guys in Toronto, essentially, we're going to make sure that we continue to throw them in jail and build prisons. So you cannot, of course, have any kind of justice reform while you maintain anti-black ideas around who's a criminal, around the idea of harsh policing and punishment. And of course, this kind of pandering to the tough on crime crowd, like God forbid, should we actually just say that we need to defund the police, we need to stop investing in punishment, we need to start investing in things like the environment, COVID recovery, housing, childcare, mental health treatment, and we don't see any of those specifics. So in terms of Black people, we, as usual, remain almost entirely absented from these speeches as though we do not exist. Although I suppose existing doesn't do you much either, because Indigenous people get mentioned. There's no better, like if you're mentioned, then you're just mentioned performatively and you still don't get anything. So we don't see anything substantive in this. Beyond that, in terms of grassroots change, I think the justice issue is a really good one to use as an example. In 2020, in both the Black and Indigenous communities across Canada, we were out in the streets in force to protest, obviously first in the wake of George Floyd, but particularly not just in response to something in the US, but specifically in the response to a number of killings of Indigenous people across this country. I think there was like 3 killings in 1 week, including a 16-year-old child, Aisha Hudson in Winnipeg. The Regis Korchinski Paquette. We had so many deaths all at once, and people in Canada were coming out specifically to say that this is an issue in Canada. And we had a mass movement. And what have we got from it? We got exactly a drug bill that doesn't properly decriminalize drugs. We can't even get full decrim in this country, even though other countries have it. We're still building more prisons. And what we've got is a few more faces around the table and money for entrepreneurship funds that have nothing to do with what we were actually putting our bodies on the line for. And today we have people being criminalized for fighting encampments, clearance for the unhoused people. 6 Black youth were just arrested in Hamilton. We have, of course, people out in Wet'suwet'en not only getting arrested on their ancestral lands, but Indigenous people who came from across Canada being arrested simply for being on the territory, being placed in dog cages, essentially, and paraded in court in their underwear. And many of those people are, of course, fighting things like a housing tract being placed on your own reserve in 6 nations. So on and on and on, we've actually seen an intensification of the criminalization of our people across this land, an intensification of building jails and prisons, an intensification of funding the police. In fact, virtually every police department got more funds this year. And it shows you that we can't direct our energies towards saying, oh, we just need the government to do this. We just need a Black cop. We just need a Black justice minister. We just need, a bit of more policy. We need wholesale change. And that is what we really have to work to fight for. One last thing I'll say before I end this long answer, but in my defense, it was a complex question. Right before I got on this Zoom, I was talking to some of the guys inside Collins Bay, the Black people who are incarcerated in Collins Bay, which is one of the prisons where many Black people are incarcerated. And they were giving me a bit of hell because they're like, like, why don't you get out there and say our stories more? You got to use your clout for us. And I was trying to say that, you got to pick your spots. It's hard and people don't want to listen. So on their behalf, I want to say that there are so many Black men and Indigenous people and women as well, and people that are non-binary and trans. I don't want to pretend it's, a gender binary here, but so many people that are serving unjust sentences, that are serving time for either offenses they did not commit or serving really enhanced sentences. Particularly, this happens to Black and Indigenous people. Many Black men convicted on things like gun charges and gang charges that are completely bogus. And these are the things we actually need to turn our attention to. We refuse to fight for the people who need it the most, the people who scare us the most, the people with the worst sentences, the people who are the bad people, the people committing the gun violence. Everybody pretends those people don't exist. And if we pretend those people don't exist, we cannot fight for justice in this country, because justice does not belong to some of us. It belongs to all of us. So I will never ride with a throne speech until it talks about Black people doing gun charges, until it dismantles the idea that Black people are the worst criminals, until it advocates for status for all, until it advocates for sovereignty of Indigenous land and respect for Indigenous territory. Like, until we hear those things, there is absolutely nothing that anybody can really say that is helpful to us. And we will continue to organize outside the system for liberation. So that's my long rant. Thank you, Robin.